Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, I have 3 different stories to tell you. First, I'll transport you to ancient Greece and introduce you to a famous and mysterious institution of antiquity, the Oracle of Delphi. For many centuries, the Pythia, the High Priestess of Apollo, delivered prophecies in a state of trance or frenzy. These prophecies were universally known and respected in the Greek world. What exactly transpired for such a long period at Delphi? We'll attempt to examine this. Next, I will narrate the enduring European myth from the Middle Ages, the changelings. It was commonly believed that babies or young children were stolen by fairies and replaced with copies or doppelgangers that were non-human. But where did this belief originate, and what underlying truths or misconceptions could possibly fuel such a myth? We will dive into that. Finally, we will relive the extravagance of the court of the last Tsars of Russia. The story of Grand Duchess Anastasia, Anastasia Romanovna, the youngest daughter of the Tsar. We will recount the Russian Revolution and the fall of the reigning family, the Romanovs. During the revolution, the entire royal family was executed, and all were thought to be dead. However, starting in the 1920s, several women claimed that they were the surviving daughters of the Tsar. One of them, in particular, appeared very convincing. Was it a lie, or did she truly escape death? We'll find out because, thanks to DNA technology, this decades-long mystery has now been irrefutably solved. But first, I would like to take a few seconds of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. If you join, you will gain access to various new features. For example, you will have the option to listen to all episodes with or without background sounds and receive regular bonus episodes. We already offer 5 exclusive episodes to our Patreons, the latest of which is about the history of mirrors. In addition, you will have the capability to download all these audios and participate in selecting future topics. We also offer advance releases and updates on upcoming episodes. We hope to see you there soon so that we can continue developing Lights Out Library, which we thoroughly enjoy. You will find a link in the description box and pinned in the first comment under the video. As always, you do not need to watch the video to follow along. If you fall asleep and wish to resume to the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Now assume a comfortable position. Maybe move a little bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you exhale, do it slowly and feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now it's time to explore. So let's begin our first story. The Oracle of Delphi. Maybe you have already heard about the Pythia. This was probably the most famous oracle of antiquity. The Pythia was not a single person, but the title given to a high priestess, the highest ranking priestess of the god Apollo in Delphi. Not much is known about how this priestess was chosen. It is likely that when the high priestess died, a new one was chosen among the various priestesses of the temple, or she may have been selected from an influential family. It is likely that she was a woman with a solid general education in politics, philosophy, history, and the arts. However, it seems the rules changed over time. In their later periods, before the institution disappeared, the Pythia was chosen for her beauty rather than her origins or education. But why was there a temple of Apollo in Delphi? Why were prophecies made? And what were they all about? To understand this, we need to go back in time to archaic Greece, more than 3,000 years ago. We usually think of classical Greece and the blossoming of Greek culture with its powerful city-states, dynamic political systems, profound philosophy, advanced science, and captivating arts. But before all of this, there was the Mycenaean civilization, which happened in the second half of the first millennium BC. The centuries before our era and before the expansion of Rome all around the Mediterranean Sea, including the Greek world. But Greece had a distinctive civilization long before this, and the origins of this unique civilization, which was advanced for its time, can be found in the late Bronze Age, more than 1,000 years before classical Greece. This civilization is called Mycenaean, named after an archaeological site in the south of Greece. The Mycenaeans were autochthonous Greeks, and they came into contact with other Mediterranean cultures, especially from Crete. I've also discussed ancient Crete in the story about the Physos disc, which you will find in my library. These cultures influenced them, and they developed a complex culture of their own. Complex in the sense that they used a writing system. They produced a large variety of crafts and had political organizations centered on cities, or at least large towns, from where rulers, living in large palaces, administered their zone of influence. In this early period of ancient Greece, an important race emerged in the subsequent millennium, which had marked influences on society, religion, and political systems. These historical snippets matter because the oracle at Delphi was most likely established during the second millennium BC, perhaps by the middle of the millennium. The exact timing, however, remains uncertain. There was a temple, but initially it would have been dedicated to Gaia, the earth goddess, and it was only much later, several centuries later in fact, that the priests of Apollo took over the temple and its oracle. Located in the heart of Greece, Delphi was not a city. Instead, it was a sacred precinct filled with temples, monuments, and shrines. By far the most renowned among these was the Temple of Apollo and its oracle. We know very little about how the oracle functioned during the Mycenaean period, even though this epoch lasted for centuries. Identically, by the end of the second millennium, the Mycenaean culture was in decline. Echoing broader trends, across the eastern Mediterranean, it was observed that all civilizations underwent major setbacks simultaneously. This phenomenon is referred to as the Late Bronze Age collapse, and the causes are still shrouded in mystery. The collapse could have been due to wars, climate changes, epidemics, or a combination of these factors. But as a result, these cultures all declined at the same time, resulting in desolated cities, decreased standards of living over several decades, evidenced by the decline in the production of crafts and buildings, and possibly even a shrinking population. Recovery from this downfall took multiple generations. When Greece ultimately did recover, it laid the groundwork for a new and splendid culture. It was during this epoch that the Oracle of Delphi gained international recognition, becoming an institution revered throughout the Greek world. Why was this oracle particularly successful? There were several factors. Delphi's strategic geographical positioning in the center of Greece and the significance of the god Apollo certainly helped. But perhaps more importantly, the Pythia, as the oracle was known, made her predictions in a state of frenzy. Belief had it that when she spoke, she was channeling the god directly through her. The specifics of the ritual remain uncertain. We'll revisit that later. But something undeniably extraordinary happened in Delphi when the oracle was consulted. The Greeks had a word to describe her state when she made her predictions: enthusiasmos, from which the modern world enthusiasm derives. However, the meaning of enthusiasmos was much stronger in ancient Greek. Enthusiasm now refers to enjoyment, interest, or approval, at most conveying a sense of mild exultation. Enthusiasmos, by contrast, signified a state of divine possession. It described something exceptional and extremely intense. The word has lost much of its intensity in contemporary usage, so enthusiasmos might be better translated as possession today, likely due to its extraordinary connotation regarding the state of exaltation or showmanship. The oracle gained considerable fame throughout the 7th century BC, and by the end of it, it had become renowned across Greece. Kings, nobles, and warriors would all travel to Delphi to consult Pythia, seeking answers or guidance about the future. However, the details of what exactly transpired remained unclear due to varying accounts of writers, like the Greeks Aristotle or Herodotus, the historian, and later Roman authors, whose reports are often elusive or sometimes contradictory. It seems the priestess took her place on a tall tripod that stood above an opening in the ground. a kind of chasm from which vapors rose. Surrounded by these fumes, she supposedly entered into a state of frenzy or trance. In this state, she spoke unintelligibly, while the priests present interpreted the prophecies and recorded them in verse. Contrarily, other sources describe the priestess speaking in her own voice, normally, with Herodotus asserting that she spoke directly in verse. There is no consensus on what exactly occurred, even though the state of possession, or enthusiasmos, is universally accepted by these sources. The primary question then arises: what caused this state of frenzy? Initial speculations suggest the vapors emanating from the ground, but it's worth noting that there was always a specific procedure enacted before prophecies were made. First, the oracle of Apollo only functioned for 9 months each year, from spring to autumn. During the winter, Apollo was said to have deserted his temple. His cult was replaced by the guild of his half-brother, Dionysus. During the months of operation, the oracle made prophecies only once a month, and before that, the priestess underwent elaborate rituals of purification, which included fasting and praying. On the 7th day of each month, her face was veiled in purple. She was guided by 2 priests to a spring near Delphi where she bathed. Then she drank holy water from another spring near the temple, where a naiad, the female spirit of streams and whales, was rumored to reside. Various accounts describe the purification ceremony that occurred in the temple. Euripides, an Athenian tragedian, reported that the floor was sprinkled with holy water. Meanwhile, consultants, the people who sought advice from the oracle, approached the temple carrying laurel branches, a symbol of Apollo. They also brought a monetary fee as an offering and a young goat to be sacrificed in the forecourt of the temple. Once the goat was sacrificed, its organs were examined to confirm that the omens were favorable. Following this, they were burned. The rising smoke signaled that the oracle was now open. The high priestess removed her veil and appeared in a simple white dress. She took her place on a tripod seat, and predictions began. Several consultants would visit throughout the day. They were introduced in an order determined by the significance of their donation to the temple or their political prominence. Representatives of city-states often inquired about various decisions, like going to war, founding a colony, sending an expedition, and receiving an embassy or signing a treaty. For centuries, it was often unthinkable for large Greek cities like Sparta, Thebes, or Athens to make a major decision without consulting the oracle first. The question, prepared and formulated beforehand with assistance from the priests, was presented to the oracle. She would respond, sometimes intelligibly, other times not. If the message wasn't clear, the priests would reveal its meaning to the consultants. There's no concrete evidence of how she gave her answers, but all accounts emphasize the frantic and supernatural nature of the experience. The faith in the oracle's legitimacy was rarely questioned, as suggested by the documents and accounts on record. The prophecies were not just intended to be visions of the future. Oracles were meant to provide guidance intended to shape future actions. But did this guidance work? It's hard to tell. Typically, in Greek tales and legends, like the story of the Trojan War, prophecies are accurate. But this isn't surprising, they are stories. If you have noticed, in every movie or novel, when a prophecy is used as a plot device, it is always accurate. Otherwise, it wouldn't be mentioned. In the real world, the oracle's guidance was always somewhat hard to comprehend. It was cryptic and subject to interpretation. So, in the many cases when individuals or Greek cities made decisions following the oracle's guidance and failed completely, it is impossible to ascertain whether the oracle delivered useless messages or if the messages were misunderstood. But there is something beyond interpretation, the state of possession or enthusiasmos, in which the Pythia delivered her prophecies. So, what could have happened? The simplest and most basic explanation could be that it was all a performance, with the Pythia instructed to act a bit deranged to produce her oracles. This could be construed as showmanship. But the Greeks were not particularly naive, and they genuinely believed that something supernatural occurred at Delphi. Moreover, the secret, if it was a scam, would have had to be passed down for generations, even centuries, without anyone coming forward to expose it. As far as we know, no one is mentioned in ancient texts claiming that the oracle was just a charade, yet people donated large sums of money to receive this guidance. So, if it was something other than a performance, there was the existence of this chasm and the vapors that rose out of it. A second group of potentially scientific explanations centers on these vapors. What if they were hallucinogenic gases? Certain hydrocarbons like ethylene, benzene, or methane have these properties and can be released from a geological chasm. Some researchers have proposed that the ground fracture could have been a seismic ground rupture. Though possible, it cannot be confirmed because the chasm has disappeared. More precisely, excavations made at Delphi revealed several small fissures, but the exact location of one above which the priestess would have sat could not be found. However, evidence of a fault line passing under Delphi exists, and there are underground deposits from which hydrocarbons could be released. Another possibility is that the hallucinations had a very different cause. We know that before the oracle session, the Pythia went through a lengthy preparation, the details of which are not precisely known. Another theory, then, is that before sitting on her tripod and answering questions, the Pythia used a plant called oleander, which included chewing its leaves and inhaling its smoke. Oleander is toxic and has been considered a poisonous plant for a long time around the Mediterranean where it grows. Ingestion causes nausea and irregular heart rhythm, and the sap may cause skin irritations. If the priestess did indeed chew the leaves and breathe the smoke from oleander, it could have caused symptoms similar to those of epilepsy. An aspect that is seductive in this theory is not just that it could work scientifically, but also that in antiquity, the Greeks and later the Romans considered epilepsy to be almost a sacred disease. People who had a fit of epilepsy were believed to be in contact with another world or the gods. And this is just what was believed of the oracle when she made her prophecies. Perhaps the vapors that rose from the chasm came from an underground space dug under the temple, where oleander or another plant would have been burnt by priests. In that case, the Pythia could have hallucinated, but it was intentionally caused, and that would actually fit an archaeological discovery made at Delphi. Indeed, there was an underground room under the temple, but there is no proof that it communicated with the room where prophecies were made, or that priests ever burnt plants to cause them. This is speculative. In any case, hallucinations are not natural phenomena. Whether provoked by man or not, the oracle of Apollo functioned for more than 1,000 years. It remained in operation and was still famous under the Roman Empire. It was abandoned only in the 4th century AD, when Christianity had spread to the entire empire and become the religion of the emperors. In 390 AD, the ruling emperor, Theodosius I, ordered the destruction of the temple as part of a policy to remove all traces of paganism, and the oracle was silenced. It was already a mystery in antiquity, and with the destruction of the temple, its secrets probably disappeared forever. Now, let's delve into a second tale, venturing several centuries forward from antiquity. You've probably heard the term changeling, but what does it mean and where does it come from? Again, we need to understand history and folklore to discover this. Taking us across Europe, where the same myth, with slight variations, was known in many countries. Historically, the changeling was referred to in English as the oaf. In contemporary language, an oaf denotes a foolish or clumsy individual, and the meanings are interconnected, as we're about to see. The term oaf originates from the Middle English elven, which in turn is derived from the Old Norse term for elf, alf. Indeed, there is a tie to ancient beliefs about elves, trolls, and fairies. A changeling, or an oaf, was perceived to be a humanoid creature, often a fairy, that had been left in a human baby's place. Fairies or other creatures were believed to have stolen a newborn and substituted it with a counterfeit, mimicking the same appearance but embodying a completely different nature, a nature that would manifest later as a child matured. While this concept may seem odd to us, it was regarded with utmost seriousness for centuries, providing an explanation for circumstances where children did not develop as expected, either physically or mentally. Typically, societies believed that if the newborn's parents weren't vigilant, fairies could steal a baby and perform this substitution. Although fairies were not always considered the culprits, in Scandinavia, trolls were generally believed to be the offenders. The trolls from Scandinavian folklore weren't always the giant humanoid monsters we associate them with in modern fantasy. although they were the inspiration for such figures. Trolls were always considered a danger to humans, but according to various sources, their appearance varied greatly, from being ugly and somewhat dim-witted to looking exactly like humans. A crucial distinction was that they always lived apart from humanity, dwelling in mountains or caves. As Scandinavian beliefs transitioned from Old Norse mythology to folklore, the characteristics of trolls morphed significantly. We started to believe that they had to live in the dark because sunlight could frighten them or even turn them into stone. They were sometimes described as man-eaters, and depending on the regions and countries of Scandinavia, they came in a variety of sizes. In some cases, they were giants, in others, dwarves. Sometimes they lived in small family huts, sometimes solitary, but clearly, they always represented a mysterious threat that people could not see. They were not necessarily evil, but they were always dangerous for humans. In Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, was not fairies or trolls, but evil female spirits like the mamuna that were predominant. These creatures sprang from Slavic mythology. They were known for living in swamps and being dangerous, and they were previously women who lived somewhat on the margins of society, such as unmarried mothers or old maids or old wives. They were believed to have turned into these demons after death. In Germany, Great Britain, Ireland, and France, they were fairies. But fairies from European folklore can be quite different from the modern image of fairies. Today, the image is generally positive. In popular culture, a fairy is often depicted as a tiny woman with wings who is kind and benevolent. At least it is a creature that we are invited to admire and not fear. But this is the 19th and 20th century interpretation of fairies, because they used to be much more ambivalent and not cute at all in the earlier centuries. Depending on local medieval folk traditions, fairies were considered either ancient pagan deities that persisted despite the rise of Christianity, or even fallen angels, demons, spirits of the dead, or spirits of nature. They always had supernatural powers, and crossing their path was not advisable because they were seen as tricksters and often as mean, or at least dangerous. Frequently, they were blamed for sickness and birth deformities. People would attempt to protect themselves from fairies by using charms such as church bells, believed to repel them, in addition to certain types of food, a four-leaf clover. It was only when people significantly reduced their belief in these supernatural creatures during the 18th and 19th centuries that they began to be depicted as endearing and wondrous. The Celtic revival that occurred in the 19th century, shedding a positive light on Celtic heritage, also rehabilitated them. Fairies saw a rise in popularity during the Victorian era, and it is this representation that continues to be prevalent in popular culture. However, it's worth noting that in the previous centuries, fairies played the same roles as trolls in Scandinavia, an ambiguous threat from creatures that were not necessarily always malicious, but also not friendly. The extensive belief in fairies in Celtic folklore might explain why, The myth of changelings was particularly common in Scotland, parts of England, Ireland, and the west of France, such as Brittany. What was the supposed motivation of fairies or trolls in changing babies? Several theories emerged. In Scandinavia, it was believed that trolls liked having their kin raised by humans. In other regions, it was postulated that enticing traits in newborns, such as blonde hair or blue eyes, attracted fairies because they desired to obtain these traits. Another legend suggested that fairy children required human milk to survive and grow. According to another version of the myth, changelings were fairies placed into human families, taking on a human appearance so they would be cared for. But why did this legend emerge and become so widespread? Although it isn't documented, some folklorists believe that there might be a grain of truth to it. Not in the sense that actual fairies exchanged babies, but perhaps exchanges were made by other humans. When this myth formed, Europe was still subject to waves of invasion and subsequent Christianization. Some groups of people may have chosen to live in obscurity at the fringes of society, either because they rejected assimilation or because they were themselves rejected. Some of the fear towards witches might have the same origin, particularly concerning women who lived in isolation from larger communities. There is a possibility that these individuals may have exchanged their own sick children for the healthy children of the invading populace. Such substitutions could have taken place in various regions, giving rise to the legend of changelings. Additionally, the concept of changelings might have been a way to explain abnormal child development. These exchange cases were not systematic, but it was often believed that, growing up, the changelings would reveal their true nature. They might develop deformations resembling fairies, trolls, or demons, or they might not be able to speak and behave in a way considered normal. A multitude of medical conditions that were not understood at the time, including mental illness and autism, might have attributed to these changelings. While it wasn't systematic, these symptoms of mental or developmental issues, termed madness in the medieval or modern era, were occasionally attributed to changelings. This belief was more prevalent in remote villages or hamlets than in towns. As protection against child swapping, parents, especially mothers, employed various measures. For example, placing a piece of iron, such as scissors, near the baby was a common practice, given the belief that fairies and trolls were afraid of iron. Other measures including placing a crucifix near newborns, baptizing them as soon as possible, and of course, maintaining continuous vigilance over them. This may sound naive, but in medieval Europe, living conditions were incredibly precarious. Famines were commonplace, and the wealth of a peasant household was determined by the number of laborers available. A disabled child who couldn't marry or produce food, but instead required care, posed significant challenges for the family, to the point where it could jeopardize the well-being of other family members. It was a harsh reality that children suspected of being changelings could be abandoned, or worse, subject to beatings or exposure to water and fire, under the belief that these actions would force them to reveal their true nature. And so, there may have been a psychological function to the myth of changelings beyond belief. It could have also served as a pretext or rationalization, enabling society to get rid of children in a way that could be justified without burdening the collective conscience. This could explain the social and psychological dimensions of the myth, and why it persisted well after the Middle Ages until the 19th century. For instance, a notorious case occurred in Ireland in 1895. A woman named Bridget Cleary was killed by her husband and family members who accused her of being a changeling. This event transpired just 125 years ago, but rural Ireland in the 19th century still resembled life 2 or 3 centuries prior. With the exception of a few manufactured products, remote counties in Ireland had largely bypassed the Industrial Revolution. The nation was impoverished, and the incident took place in Clonmel, a town in County Tipperary. Bridget was born in 1869, and at the age of 18 she married Michael Cleary, a cooper. Displaying an unusual degree of independence for her time and location, she became somewhat of a professional following her marriage. She owned a small flock of chickens and sold eggs. She also possessed a sewing machine and crafted dresses for sale. The exact status of her relationship with her husband is unclear. Early in the marriage, she moved in with her elderly parents, and they did not cohabit. This didn't necessarily indicate formal separation, but suggested they were both young and not yet prepared to establish a home together. However, after several years, they managed to settle down and live in an attractive house in Clonmel. Interestingly, the dwelling had a slightly suspicious reputation, as it was built on the site of a supposed fairy ring fort. That is to say, the house was erected on the remains of a prehistoric dwelling or stone circle believed to be a fairy ring. In March 1895, Bridget fell ill, suffering from what seemed to be bronchitis for over a week, until a physician was brought to visit her. She was gravely ill, so much so that a priest was summoned to administer last rites as a precaution. In the subsequent 2 days, not only her husband, but also several friends and family members, including her father, became utterly convinced that Bridget was not just sick, but possessed, or that she was no longer herself. They subjected her to treatments or rituals meant to expel the purported fairy within her, such as taking her near a fireplace. It was widely believed that changelings must reveal their true nature when exposed to fire. In the following days, rumors began to circulate that Bridget was missing. Local police initiated a search, and her husband claimed that she had been abducted by fairies. Soon after, her body was found in a shallow grave. The coroner who examined the body concluded that her death resulted from burning. 9 people were accused in what was treated as a murder investigation, including her husband Michael. 5 of these individuals were indicted by jury on charges of wounding, leading to a trial. Evidence presented at the trial suggested that this was not simply a case of her husband concealing his wife's murder with a convenient legend. He genuinely believed that Bridget had become a changeling. Shared in this conviction were several other family members who had participated in her mistreatment. Their primary line of defense was their sincere belief that she was no longer herself. They did not intend to kill Bridget, but sought to restore her to her rightful identity. Such a defense might have held weight in a trial 200 or 300 years earlier, but in 1895 it stood as no justification. Here were two worldviews juxtaposed, one grounded in traditional belief and superstition, the other in modern rationality and law. The tragic fact remained that a woman had died, and her husband was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In retrospect, authors have speculated that there might have been a psychotic disorder affecting Michael Cleary, perhaps due to the stress of managing Bridget's illness. This might have swayed others via a shared superstition. The social and psychological dynamics at play here could echo those found in historical instances of witch hunts, but conclusions remain uncertain. It is indeed sad that almost 10 people who knew Bridget well suddenly became absolutely convinced that she was no longer herself. Now, for our third story of the night, we are moving to Russia, a century ago, at the time of the Russian Revolution. I'll tell you about the life of Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna of Russia and the question of her possible survival. As you possibly know, the last Tsar of Russia was Nicholas II. During the Russian Revolution, Nicholas II abdicated. He didn't really have a choice. His power had vanished and his family had been placed under house arrest, Tsarskoye, the summer palace of the Tsars near St. Petersburg. As a second revolution was taking place and the Bolsheviks were advancing, the government sent the family to Siberia so that they wouldn't fall into the hands of the Bolsheviks. But within a few months, the Bolsheviks seized control of a large part of Russia, and the royals became their prisoners. They were moved again to the city of Yekaterinburg. This captivity, which lasted for months, was very uncertain, and for the children of the Tsar and the Tsarina, who had always lived in luxury and without major concerns, it was probably very destabilizing. The fall was spectacular. Anastasia was born in 1901. She was only 16 when the revolution happened, and she was the youngest of the 4 daughters. In total, the Tsar and the Tsarina had 5 children. The only boy, the Tsarevich, was born after Anastasia. The royal daughters were called Grand Duchesses. That was Anastasia's title. Before the revolution, the lives of these children were unlike any other in Russia. They were very protected. They had little connection with their country. They moved between different palaces, especially the Winter Palace in the heart of St. Petersburg and the Summer Palace in Tsarskoye. They were surrounded by dozens of servants and private instructors and maids. The only other children they encountered were from the highest nobility. They were constantly supervised and cared for. There was discipline, but they immersed themselves in a world of luxury and abundance which, conceivably, no other royal family could have enjoyed at the time. Other European monarchies, too, had their palaces and servants, but their powers were confined, and their residences were not as extravagant as those of the Romanovs. The bubble, created by the royal court, was entirely detached from the rest of the country, where the ordinary man was still poor and knew very little of the rest of the world. In contrast, the Russian court was very international, and since the 18th century, its members spoke more German and French than Russian. They learned Russian out of necessity, but the empresses were traditionally chosen from German princesses, and the children were educated in French and English. They were aware of the poverty and suffering in Russia because they were informed. They had to make appearances at charities or visit hospitals during wartime to demonstrate solidarity. However, this was largely an intellectual exercise, as the reality of their lives consisted of comfort, lavish interiors, and rooms full of toys. So, when the revolution commenced and the family was imprisoned, their world crumbled entirely. Their captivity lasted for 4 months, until July 1918, when a group of Bolsheviks in Ekaterinburg executed them. During this time, Russia was spiraling into a civil war between the Bolsheviks and their Red Army on the communist side, and the Royalists, or the Whites, who commanded several previously Tsarist armies. The extermination of the Romanovs was a preventative measure, ensuring they wouldn't be recaptured by their partisans. Additionally, it turned out to be psychological warfare, intended to quell the counter-revolutionaries. With the deaths of the Tsar Nicholas and his only son, there was no longer a Tsar to restore the throne. The world was shocked, as executions of monarchs are uncommon, and it was assumed that the entire family was dead. Anastasia and her sisters, Olga, Tatiana, and Maria, would be remembered as young women who never really had a chance to express their personalities or leave a trace, victims of tragic circumstances that they could not influence. Indeed, there are not many things to say about her 3 older sisters, but Anastasia would not be forgotten that easily. Within a month after her death, several young women began to claim to be her. Most of them, including the most famous one, Anna Anderson, insisted for decades that they were Anastasia, garnered their supporters and sometimes witnesses to corroborate their claims, leading to a mystery that would last for decades. Was Anastasia really dead? So why these claims, and how credible were they? Firstly, it's interesting to notice that Russia is no stranger to these kinds of claims. Going back centuries, the country has a long tradition of impostors claiming to be officially dead princess. Rightful heirs to the throne generally did this for political reasons, to challenge the power of the exiles. Many rebels, led by impostors, were repressed. The most famous was a peasant uprising at the time of Catherine II, Catherine the Great, in the 18th century, led by Pugachev, a man who claimed to be the rightful Emperor Peter III. Secondly, the execution of the family had taken place behind closed doors. This secretive nature served the interests of the Bolsheviks, with no direct, irrefutable proof accessible to the public, you had no choice but to believe the Bolsheviks. The public had no access to evidence. Furthermore, it was during a civil war. One could not be sure of anything. When someone came forward claiming to be a surviving member of the Romanov family, you could not oppose them with any argument since no one could know for sure what had happened to them. What if the Bolsheviks had let one or several daughters escape? What if Anastasia had feigned death and managed to go into hiding with the help of someone? Maybe. Why not? Actually, for every child of the family, there were several claimants, the Grand Duchesses and the Tsarevich. It was in this troubled context that several women came forward starting from 1920, claiming that they were Anastasia. Two of them, who claimed to be Anastasia and her sister Maria, were taken in by a priest in the Ural Mountains, not far from Ekaterinburg, in 1919. They became nuns and claimed until their death in 1964 that they were the daughters of the fallen Tsar. Another claimant was Eugenia Smith. Upon relocating to America, she was born Eugenia Smithisko in Austria-Hungary, probably 2 years before Anastasia, and changed her name to Eugenia Smith. She defended her supposed identity for decades. She even went as far as writing an autobiography in which she recounted her alleged life at the court of St. Petersburg. However, for reasons that I will explain later, we now know that this account was entirely fabricated. Despite that, she might have ended up believing her own story. Her main rival was Anna Anderson, arguably the most famous claimant of all. Interested in this mystery often had to choose a side between the two. An interesting anecdote took place in 1963 at a publishing house. The publishing company had been contacted by a purported former Polish army officer, Tsarevich Alexei, the younger brother of Anastasia, but he was also an impostor. A meeting arranged between this Polish claimant and Eugenia Smith. Despite being complete strangers, when they met, they embraced and cried, reaffirming each other's supposed identities. 2 years later, they had a falling out, and Eugenia Smith denounced him as a fraud. She certainly knew what she was talking about. Another example occurred in Russia with a woman named Nadezhda Vasilyeva. She surfaced in Siberia in 1920 while attempting to travel from Russia to China. Traveling abroad was prohibited at the time, and the Bolsheviks captured her, suspecting she could be a spy. Consequently, she was imprisoned for a long time in Moscow and Leningrad, now named St. Petersburg, and then on various islands in the White Sea north of Russia. Ultimately, she was moved to multiple mental institutions. She sent letters in French and German to King George V of the United Kingdom, pleading for help for his cousin Anastasia. There was never any response, and she spent decades in incarceration. She changed her claim at one point, declaring that she was the daughter of a merchant from Riga, before reverting to her original contention that she was Anastasia. She passed away in 1971 in an asylum. We also know that she was not telling the truth, but her origins remained uncertain. Given her education and ability to speak foreign languages, it's entirely possible that she came from a wealthy family, perhaps even an aristocratic one. There's no way to know for sure. It could be that her real family lost everything and were scattered during the turmoil of the revolution. The most notable of all Anastasias was Anna Anderson. She might not have been Anastasia, but her life was incredibly extraordinary. Her known story began in 1920 in Berlin, Germany, 18 months after the execution of the Romanovs. On a winter's day, a young woman attempted suicide by jumping off a bridge in Berlin. The police rescued her and placed her in a hospital. Lacking identification, she refused to disclose her identity. According to hospital staff, she seemed to speak German with a Russian accent. For the following 2 years, she resided in a mental hospital where, coincidentally, another patient claimed to be Grand Duchess Tatiana, Anastasia's sister. A select few Russian émigrés, originating from areas not too far from the palace in St. Petersburg, visited her and believed her claims. However, Anna Anderson, who had yet to disclose her identity, neither confirmed nor denied anything. Upon visiting the alleged Tatiana, these visitors suspected they might have found Anastasia as well. Consequently, she was discharged from the asylum and accommodated in a Berlin home of a Russian immigrant, an aristocrat who had lived in Poland prior to the revolution. Whether he believed her to be Anastasia and wanted to assist her, or had other motivations in hosting an alleged Grand Duchess, remains unclear. By 1922, the counter-revolution had lost the Civil War, but outside Russia there was still some faint hope for the restoration of the Tsardom. This enigmatic woman began to call herself Anna Tchaikovsky, with Anna serving as a short form of Anastasia. A police investigation was conducted to determine whether she was Anastasia Romanov, but it proved inconclusive. Over time, she embraced the claim and asserted that she was indeed Anastasia. A few years later, she fell ill. Several members of the court who had escaped Russia paid her a visit, given her fame within Russian circles in Western Europe. These visitors included the ex-groom of the chamber of the Tsarina, Anastasia's French tutor in St. Petersburg, and the Tsar's sister, all individuals who had encountered her many times before the revolution. Eventually, the world refuted her claims to be Anastasia. They simply did not recognize her. However, the community of Russians in exile became divided over her case. Some believed her or expressed doubt, but by the mid-1920s, she had become, by far, the most famous and substantial claimant to be Anastasia. The defunct Tsarina was from a German aristocratic family. The Dukes of Hesse and the Grand Duke would have been Anastasia's uncle, had she still been alive. Therefore, he funded a private investigation, and the investigation identified her as a Polish factory worker with a history of mental illness. A lengthy lawsuit began, which brought her case into the mainstream. She became famous well beyond the Russian communities, and through media coverage, she gained more supporters. These people were not necessarily connected to the Romanovs or Russians, but were touched or intrigued by her claim. For Anna, a strained life began and lasted almost 50 years. She alternated between living in Germany and the USA, and between the home of various supporters in nursing homes, and once even resided in an asylum. In 1968, She officially emigrated to America and married a history professor from Charlottesville, Virginia, who completely believed in her case. She passed away in 1984, leaving behind hundreds of supporters worldwide and numerous books written about her. Independent investigators tried everything, from examining the shape of her ear and comparing it to Anastasia's in photos, to arranging meetings with witnesses. Their findings were never really conclusive. She didn't have much to substantiate her claim, but there were enough people who had lived in or visited the palaces before the revolution who expressed doubt. So it kept her case alive. When she died in 1984, it seems that the mystery of Anna Anderson and Anastasia would remain unexplained forever, but it didn't. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the locations of the bodies of the Tsars and the Tsarina and all their children were revealed. The remains were located and they were tested for DNA in various countries and laboratories. And all the results concurred. Each child was individually identified in the remains, including Anastasia. She died in 1918 along with the rest of the family. Her body was there to prove it, and all claimants were either lying or deluded. Anna Anderson's DNA was also tested using a lock of her hair. These tests did not exist yet when she died, and they revealed that she had no connection whatsoever with the Romanovs. It had been a fantasy all along for her and all other claimants. We've come to the end of our journey tonight. I hope you enjoyed this adventure, and I invite you to discover and learn more. Now you can let go and sleep. Or if you're not sleepy yet, you may pick another story from my ever-growing library. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.